Hi, this is Jonathan Armstrong from Caudry, the specialist compliance law firm, and glad that you could join us and that Eric Sinrod can join us as well from California. And this is another one of our TechLaw10 film/audio things. And Eric, one of the questions that I guess I'm being asked most often is, it's okay that we've got privacy law in the US and in the EU and in the UK, but is any of this being enforced? Is this just a regulator's wish list, or are there actually enforcement cases coming down the line? So CCPA is one of the most commonly asked questions. What's happening with CCPA?
So yes, I'm going to tell you about the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA. By the way, I'm Eric Sinrod at Duane Morris, based in San Francisco. We're an international law firm. I'm going to give you sort of the framework of the statute first, and then I'll tell you about whether or not it's a wish list or whether or not it's actually being enforced, which was your question. So the CCPA is a state statute which is intended to enhance privacy rights and consumer protection for residents of California. And it was signed into law, well, it became effective, I should say, January 1st of 2020, and then it was beefed up later that year in a proposition by California voters. The intentions of the act are to provide protections to California residents, and it's considered perhaps one of the strongest, if not the strongest, state privacy law in the country, in the US. And the rights are for a consumer to know what personal data is being collected about them, to know whether their personal data is being sold or disclosed and to whom, to be able to say no to the sale of one's personal data, to have the ability to access one's personal data, to be able to request a business to delete any personal information about a consumer collected from that consumer, and to not be discriminated against by exercising privacy rights, which we will get to, don't worry. What kind of businesses does the CCPA apply to? Well, it applies to all businesses that collect consumers' personal data and that do business in California, at least in one of the following thresholds. The business has annual gross revenues of over $25 million. It buys, receives, or sells personal information of 50,000 or more consumers or households, or earns more than half of its annual revenue from selling consumers' personal information. And again, we're talking about California consumers. If a business is within one of those criteria or more of those criteria, they are required, quote, to implement and maintain reasonable security procedures and practices, close quote, in protecting California consumer data. So now we sort of get to the action that you were referring to. Where can there be legal redress? Well, companies that become victims of data theft or other data security breaches can be ordered in civil class action lawsuits to pay statutory damages of between $100 and $750 per California resident and incident, or actual damages, whichever is greater. And I'm sure you can imagine, Jonathan, that can add up. And this might be of interest to you. Liability may also apply in respect of businesses in overseas countries who ship items into California. Let me give you the data that I have at my fingertips, my magic fingertips here. And this data refers to calendar years 2020 and 2021. That's the most recent information I have. And this goes to your question, was this a wish list or has there been actual litigation? As of the end of 2021, nearly 200 lawsuits have been filed that assert claims for violation of the CCPA. These cases span essentially every industry, including biotech, finance, healthcare, and technology. And the year 2021 saw a significant 40% increase in the number of court filings as compared to 2020. And in 2021, there already were a number of notable court rulings and court-approved class action settlements. Let me just give you a little bit more information because you asked the question. The total number of court filings in 2021 increased significantly over the prior year, as I said. There were 78 total legal cases filed under the CCPA in 2020, and that number jumped to 110 court filings in 2021. That's the 40% increase. And keep in mind, that's a 40% increase in just the 2 years or so of the statute being in effect. I should point out that the CCPA does not provide consumers with a private right of action beyond, the data breach claim itself. In terms of filings by industry, it's kind of interesting. In 2020, most of the CCPA cases focused on the technology sector with an emphasis on software. In 2021, finance and fintech companies had the most CCPA actions filed against them, and the communications and healthcare sectors also saw a significant number of filings. Finishing up, let's talk about class actions because that's where the real money can be, at least at the aggregate. At the end of 2021, there had already been about 17 class action settlements. The monetary relief in the settlements to date, well, when I say to date, by the end of 2021, encompassed a wide range from anywhere from $250,000 to $85 million in a class action case, dependent largely on class size. Class settlements range from anywhere between 46 cents to $244 per class member, and the median settlement value overall was $2.6 million. I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you. The general trend is that the smaller class action cases have a larger settlement value per class member, whereas the larger class settlements with more class members, each person takes less. And then finally, I'll just say that in addition to the monetary relief afforded in these class action settlements, there's also a prospective relief component like credit monitoring or required data security enhancements, et cetera. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Yeah. So enforcement is in the main through the class action mechanism rather than regulatory interventions. Then
that's what I've seen. Yes.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, then segueing to Europe. That's sort of almost the opposite. We have, I think, a fledgling class action industry that's looking at GDPR claims, but many of those claims have met roadblocks along the way, and we're seeing some of them withdrawn. I know, for example, one US law firm launched with great fanfare a class action that was going to be on both sides of the pond. So its London office would handle claimants in Europe, and the US Home Office would handle claimants in the US. They had two parallel dedicated websites depending on where you were, and I visited the Europe version of the website, which just retained an error that this page no longer existed, although the action's progressing in the US. So I think some law firms have put class actions into the too difficult box over here, although people are pursuing other types of case, misuse of data type cases under tort law rather than the statutory right under GDPR. But that, of course, may change. And we're still seeing a lot of litigation that's not class action related, using GDPR rights, people suing because they say their data has been mishandled, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think in monetary terms, the real effect has been enforcement by regulators. So as we sit here today, just under 1.5 billion euros worth of reported fines, so 1.472 if you want the exact figure. And I say reported because some regulators really tell people what they're up to on an annual basis rather than real time. And with that caveat, 1,559 reported GDPR fines to date. And enforcement, interestingly, that you said that there was some sector-based trends. I think we're detecting that under GDPR as well. The TMT sector, so your technology and telecoms and media in between, has more than €1 billion worth of those fines. So that's, what, 70% ish of the total. Retail is next with only €61 million worth of fines. But of course, there's a classification issue here. Amazon fine is just north of €740 million. That's classified as a TMT business. You could equally make the case for saying it's a retail business. And if that were the case, then that 1 billion versus 61 million divide would move substantially, given that Amazon alone is €740 million. But we have seen high fines for retail as well, €35 million ish for H&M. I guess the other thing that's maybe interesting, GDPR versus CCPA, is not all countries are equal in terms of GDPR enforcement. So Spain is top of the league table with 537 reported fines to date, versus the bottom of the league table, Latvia with 4, Slovakia with 2, Finland with 1. So there's a huge gulf, obviously, between 537 and 1. And maybe the other two things I'd focus on is, I think pre-GDPR, many people thought that nearly all of the cases would be about data breach. That hasn't turned out to be the case at all. A lot of the larger fines are about transparency. So saying to people you will do one thing with their data and doing something else instead. And that, I think, is partly why there's been that heavy concentration on the TMT sector, particularly as it relates to selling data for advertising, which I know is one of the harms that CCPA was designed to get at. And certainly GDPR is being used a lot for that by internet businesses that are selling data on people to market products to. And then the other thing I'd mention in passing is that not all privacy enforcement is under GDPR. So we have a different directive that deals with things like cookies, which are, again, a real area of enforcement here. In the UK, that's called PICA. And generally speaking, those figures I gave you don't include things like cookie enforcement action. Some of that's included in the GDPR figures. Some of it's done under a separate bit of legislation. So I guess the trend I'm drawing from both of this is that the legal industry, if you like, around privacy is alive and kicking and well. And there's significant activity, both in California and in the GDPR world, but that in some respects the issue is being addressed in different ways, by fines in the main in Europe and by private litigation in California.
Yeah, all really good points. And you mentioned sort of other asserted rights beyond data breach. As I alluded to, the CCPA really is primarily focused on data breach itself. And then in terms of, what's interesting about the CCPA, and maybe it's a hallmark of our system, if you will, but it does create this private right of action. And where there's a private right of action, and there can be a number of consumers affected and impacted, and their class action attorneys, come to the fore and almost act as private attorney generals, enforcing the rights of those consumers to the benefit of the consumers, but obviously to the class action attorneys, they get a nice piece of the pie if they succeed. Of course, they take on the risk if they don't succeed. So I'm not here to say that there can't be regulatory enforcement. I'm just sort of, and part of my practice too, I focus on the litigation angle, and that's something that is strong in the United States. It'll be interesting to see whether other states follow suit. to the California model. You know, it's not uncommon where one state sort of takes the lead in an area, then others say me too. And then sometimes, for example, when we were dealing, 20 years ago with spam, states were coming up with anti-spam laws, and finally, years later, our federal Congress enacted, the Canned Spam Act, and then there was a federal law in the books. Finally, I'll just point out that there is maybe a difference between CCPA, where maybe in one area it's a little bit narrower than GDPR, because the CCPA really focuses on and gives rights to consumers with respect to data provided by the consumer itself, where I believe GDPR is broader in terms of like essentially all data that relates to a consumer, whether the consumer offered it up or not. What do you think?
That's right. And that's a good distinction. And I think a lot of the cases have been about what you might call acquired data. So whether that be a data controller acquiring data from somebody else, or that data controller acquiring data from people and then giving it to somebody else. A lot of the cases are around that. And as I say, warehousing of data on individuals to sell to advertisers, which is clearly a concern right across the EU.
Yeah. So hope I answered your question sufficiently.
You did. Yeah. And that was a fascinating discussion. And obviously, everybody now has the right numbers at their fingertips. So I guess that's it for this week. We'll put our details at the bottom of the screen if you're watching on YouTube, and we're open to suggestions for future topics. We'll speak again in a month or so, and if people have got burning questions that they want to ask either of us, then we're quite happy to take suggested topics. But I'm Jonathan.Armstrong at CaudryCompliance.com, and Eric, why don't you wrap up?
Yeah, sure. I'm EJ Sinrod at DwayneMorris.com, and it's been a pleasure to be with you today, Jonathan, and we look forward to the next one.
Thanks for watching.